Hello guys, welcome to a new edition of React Today as part of the World's Way Out project. Lately I have no choice but to read some documents now that the public opinion is being taken down of the mainstream platforms, which is just ridiculous. The coming of Elon Musk to the mainstream media with Twitter, 44 billion, even 10 more billion than the war in Ukraine. Yeah, these billionaires, which is another aspect that we need to speak about. How are we putting our hands in the hands of billionaires in order for them to change constitutional law, institutions, powers, which are supposed to represent the peoples, which are not represented by billionaires. And their technology is an amazing discovery. It's awesome, good for that. But they have been proven, like in the case of Facebook, that it's not that good. That they have been targeting different people in elections times and teenagers, knowingly putting profit on top of benefits. And the word is that Zuckerberg is losing a lot of money, yeah, whatever. In this case with Twitter, he is going to abide by the law, and the law is what the law says it is. And what the law says it is in the case of the pandemic, for example, we all know, you and I, is what the World Health Organization decides to be. And the World Health Organization is corrupted by the money of Bill Gates, as demonstrated by many YouTubers, and I before them in the Spanish version, and many others throughout history is very well documented. So this is not about false information, misinformation, or disinformation. This is about truth, regardless of the misinformation and the disinformation. We're going to clear that up.
I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. At Wednesday's Senate Homeland Security Committee hearing, Senator Rand Paul pressed Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas on the Steele dossier. Paul accused the Homeland Security Secretary of not acknowledging that the controversial Steele dossier was disinformation. Paul also expressed concern about the new DHS Disinformation Governance Board. Mayorkas defended the board and claimed that Paul was mischaracterizing his opinion. Take a look at the fiery Senate exchange.
For your questions.
Do you think the Steele dossier included Russian disinformation?
Senator, that's not a question that I'm equipped to answer.
It was in the public news. It was you may have heard of it, the Mueller investigation. It was a $32 million investigation that went over a couple of years. Horowitz was an investigator general, and he looked at the FBI's activity in the beginning of this. And what the FBI concluded was that there were FBI agents throughout this period of time who concluded that, yes, the dossier was full of Russian disinformation. So let's say it is Russian disinformation. You say your new Disinformation Governance Board is going to help the public with disinformation. You claim it's not going to be about domestic, it's going to be about foreigners and those evil Russians. So here's my question. The FBI concludes that the Steele dossier was full of Russian disinformation. CNN propagated this disinformation gladly for years and years. The difference, I guess, between your opinion and our opinion is that as despicable as it is that CNN propagated this disinformation, I wouldn't shut them down. I wouldn't lecture them. I wouldn't put it on a government website that CNN's wrong for propagating disinformation. The problem you have is you're not even willing to admit, I mean, we can't even have an agreement on what the FBI said was disinformation. How do you propose that you're going to have an office of disinformation governance if you see the problem in even determining what is disinformation?
Oh, Senator, because our work is not focused on disinformation writ large. Where we, the Department of Homeland Security, become involved is when there's a connectivity between disinformation and threats to the security of the homeland.
Well, that's what the Russians might be considered that. You mentioned the Russians the other day when you tried to pivot away from this being about censorship. But let's say it is the Russians. I know you're not going to ever agree that the Steele dossier, which y'all spent so much money on, was disinformation. But it was, and the FBI concluded. But let's just say there's an imaginary disinformation. You've discovered tomorrow Russian disinformation that's going to hurt our national security. And CNN's broadcasting it. What are you going to do?
Senator, let me...
You're going to tell Putin, you shouldn't do this.
Senator,
what are you going to do?
Senator, let me explain what we do. in the Department of Homeland Security with respect to disinformation, and frankly, what we've been doing for nearly 10 years across different administrations. The cartels propagate disinformation that Title 42 does not apply to a particular community of migrants from a particular country.
How are they propagating this?
If I may, through social media, and what we do through U.S. Customs and Border Protection is actually communicate via social media and other channels that is false, that we do apply Title 42.
So let's say there's Russian disinformation as well. Are you going to take to social media and broadcast that people are broadcasting something incorrect about what do you think is Russian disinformation?
Senator, let me emphasize.
Well, you said the other day Russians, and now you're saying not so much the Russians, you're saying the cartels.
No, I'm not. No, I'm not, Senator. You're mischaracterizing my statement.
Then what are you going to do if there's Russian disinformation? You're going to broadcast something on social media?
Allow me to share when we become involved in the Department of Homeland Security. We become involved when disinformation poses a threat to the security of our country. It is when there's a connectivity to a threat to our country. It could be a connectivity to violence. And what this working group does, is precisely what I would think you would want it to do, which is to take a look at the disinformation work that our department has done and ask the following questions. Do we have policies? Do we have guardrails? Do we have standards?
But here's the
to
problem.
ensure,
We can't even agree. We can't even agree what disinformation is. You can't even agree that it was disinformation, that the Russians fed information to the Steele dossier. If you can't agree to that, how are we ever going to come to an agreement on what is disinformation so you can police it on social media?
Senator, I have 2 points, if I may finish. Number one, that what this working group does, because it's not an office, what this working group does is ensure that there are guardrails, definitions, standards to make sure that the free speech rights, the civil rights, civil liberties, and privacy rights of individuals are not impinged.
Do you think COVID disinformation threatens our national security?
And number two, if I may, Senator, and number two, is it your proposition that when the cartels spread disinformation with respect to our immigration policies to try to lure vulnerable migrants to our border illegally?
I think you've got no idea what disinformation is, and I don't think the government's capable of it. Do you know who the greatest propagator of disinformation in the history of the world is? The U.S. government. Are you familiar with McNamara, the Pentagon Papers? Are you familiar with George W. Bush and the weapons of mass destruction? Are you familiar with Iran-Contra? I mean, think of all the debates and disputes we've had over the last 50 years in our country. We work them out by debating them. We don't work them out by the government being the arbiter. I don't want you guardrails. I want you to have nothing to do with speech. You think we can't determine, speech by traffickers is disinformation? You think the American people are so stupid they need you to tell them what the truth is? You can't even admit what the truth is with the Steele dossier. I don't trust government to figure out what the truth is. Government is largely disseminating disinformation. So I do have a question, and here's the question. So the Russians, maybe some cartels. What about COVID disinformation? Is that in your bailiwick for your disinformation governance board?
Senator, you would have to give me the details with...
Okay, here.
The point is, it is the governments, the prime ministers, the secretaries of states, the spokespeople for those guys who are supposed to represent us in Parliament, because we are supposed to be their constituency. I mean, we voted for them and we believe in their program. And once they're in power, the program goes to hell and f the people. They show us a finger. I don't think so. It is time for us, the country and the world, to not only understand but take action. The World Health Project has a proposal for you, citizens of New Zealand, Australia, all Europe, 28 countries, and the 30 countries in NATO, and the countries that belonged in the past to Russia, the USSR, the United Socialist Republic of Russia, in order to understand history better. Just watching France 24 the other day, the debate France 24, and there was 4 invited people there, 3 women and a guy, and there was no debate whatsoever. They were all agreeing that Russia is the bitch and Russia is to blame and we have to destroy them, change regime, like in Central and South America, like we want to do with Yemen, with Iran, we did in Iraq, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, etc., etc., etc. Central and South America. I mean, I can read you many aspects that we know, as published in my last video, about how the United States cannot keep going around the world with Israel, killing and destroying peoples and constitutions and wiping up their butts with it.
You're happy to correctly use the most strong and robust language to describe the crimes against humanity of Vladimir Putin, but you will not use the same strength of language when it comes to describing Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, when it is now being documented and detailed by 2 of the most respected human rights organizations in the world. And to be honest, anybody who looks honestly at the decades of brutal, inhumane persecution of the Palestinians, successive assaults on Gaza, the annexation of their land and territory, the systematic application of apartheid rules, you don't want to even use the word apartheid. Never mind sanctions. 5 days sanctions against Putin and his thugs, 70 years of oppression by the Palestinians, and it wouldn't be, what was the word you used? It wouldn't be helpful to impose sanctions. Amnesty International are calling for Israel to be referred to the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. Will you support it? They are calling for targeted sanctions against Israeli officials who are perpetuating the system of apartheid, just exactly the same types of sanctions you've just initiated against Vladimir Putin. Will you support it? And I think the answer is clearly you're not going to.
Yeah, the law doesn't apply to them. They are the mightiest, they are no way. And Canada cannot permit this to happen, not from the will of the people. I think we, the Canadians, have demonstrated, us is the CPAC channel in Canada, how some conservatives have been attacking the Liberal Party and their decision regarding the application of the Emergency Act that we explained before, according to the Constitution, before my program was removed from YouTube, even though I was speaking about the Constitution, the Canadian Constitution and the Canadian Charter of Bill of Rights and Freedoms. We'll get to that again. I don't try any fight with YouTube. I would like to keep the channel, if they're interested in truth and documents. Today, we're going to speak a little bit about articles that have been published and why Canada is not Canada any longer, including, of course, the perception of important people around the world that I have been in contact with. I have had interesting conversations. For example, the 9/11 conversation, etc., which is an issue that I wouldn't like to say that he underestimated my position, but I answered him in a program of 1 hour and more minutes, and you should watch that.
Okay, George, I wanted to speak a little bit about towers. I am a journeyman welder. I am qualified on steel. I can build the Golden Gate. I work with steel that is more than 5/8 inches thick, and I know what they can support or stand for. I'm not an engineer, I'm just a welder. But I totally agree with the
Never
guys
say
that.
that. Some of my best friends are welders. Go ahead, Federico.
Yes, but I do agree with the engineers that talked to you before, George, and the sense that it's impossible, literally, through physics, through the laws of physics, that the three towers just came down the way they did. And there's a hypothesis that I would like you to consider. If, to me, the laws of physics are exponentially proof that that was totally planned. How come Dick Cheney, how come George Bush in 20 years didn't have any answers about what happened in this case when the laws of physics proves?
Well, they're definitely hiding something, probably a lot of things, Federico. But again, I'm back to my two questions. If you are going to fly airplanes into these buildings, why would you need to take the utterly potentially terminal risk of seeding this building with explosives and bring it down when you were going to fly airplanes into it anyway?
It wouldn't be the first time they try and accomplish something like that. You know the power that the Pentagon have on the media. Investigative journalism, as Max Blumenthal made a program yesterday about these issues. And
I'll look out for that. I'm a big admirer of Max.
Sure, but they not only mention that, they can get away with it because they control the media. And if you see the documentary, which is a movie actually.
Well, they don't control this media. They're not controlling our conversation now. And there's a million people. There's a million people around the world listening and watching to this show every week. So, controlling the media, they don't control RT.
Just consider the hypothesis that this was planned with complicity of high spheres in the United States. I think you cannot just reject that hypothesis.
I never reject any hypothesis.
But just consider that hypothesis, George, because it's very probable. They have done it before with the Gulf of Tonkin. They have get away with a lot of financial issues. But they profited with the war. They profited with the war in Iraq.
No, but you're not answering my fundamental point. Why do both? Why not either blow up the towers or hijack airplanes and fly them into the towers? Why do both? Why do both?
George, democracy doesn't exist, not even in England.
That's not what I'm asking you. I'm asking you, a welder, I'm asking you, why do both? That's nothing to do with controlling the media. It's nothing to do with democracy not existing. Why do both, Federico?
Okay, nobody can literally disagree with the mainstream media, and you saw that the years after. Now we can speak, but in the years after the events, nobody was.
I'm asking, last time, third time.
The 9/11 Commission.
Third time.
The 9/11 Commission was a
all right, enough.
It's on my YouTube channel, Federico Molano. You go to Federico Molano, that's it. React to the part of the World Project. Okay, so the West's hands in Ukraine are as bloody as Putin's. Ukrainians will pay the price to wear down Russia, just as Syrians, Libyans, Iranians, Yemenis, Venezuelans, and Palestinians have paid the price, as the United States has sought to attain the goals of its globe-spanning imperial project. By Jonathan Cook. There is a discursive nervous tick all over social media at the moment, including from prominent journalists such as Guardian's columnist George Monbiot. The demand is that everyone not only condemn Russian President Vladimir Putin for invading Ukraine, but to do so without qualification. Everybody has to do it. Any reluctance to submit your opinion or your mind to blame Putin, any reluctance to submit is considered certain proof that the person is a Putin apologist or a Kremlin bot, and that their views on everything under the sun, especially their criticisms of equivalent Western war crimes, can be safely ignored. How convenient for all those Western leaders who have committed war crimes at least as bad as Russia's current ones. I have repeatedly described Russia's invasion as illegal. I have regularly called Putin a war criminal. You may not have noticed, but I just did it again in the two preceding paragraphs. And I have consistently compared Putin's deed to the very worst actions taken by the West over the past 2 decades. But none of that is enough. More is always needed. The demand for unequivocal denunciation is a strange, if common, one and suggests that those insisting on it are being dishonest, if only with themselves. The function of the demand is not to clarify whether any particular piece of information or an argument is credible. It is intended purely as a gotcha meme. I don't remember an insistence that anyone condemned Tony Blair or George W. Bush for the invasion of Iraq in 2003 before they could be heard or taken seriously, or that they denounced the United States-backed overthrow of Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi that plunged the country into a murderous chaos, or that they deplored the West's material support for Saudi Arabia's slaughter of Yemen's population, including Britain's sale of planes, bombs, and training to Riyadh, or that they criticized the West's backing of the head-chopping jihadists in Syria, who coincidentally now appear to be drifting into Ukraine to become our allies again, or that they decried decades of Western support for Israel as it has disappeared the Palestinian people.
You're happy to correctly use the most strong and robust language to describe the crimes against humanity of Vladimir Putin, but you will not use the same strength of language when it comes to describing Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, when it is now being documented and detailed by two of the most respected human rights organizations in the world. And to be honest, anybody who looks honestly at the decades of brutal, inhumane persecution of the Palestinians, successive assaults on Gaza, the annexation of their land and territory, the systematic application of apartheid rules, you don't want to even use the word apartheid. Never mind sanctions. 5 days sanctions against Putin and his thugs, 70 years of oppression by the Palestinians, and it wouldn't be, what was the word you used? It wouldn't be helpful to impose sanctions. Amnesty International are calling for Israel to be referred to the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. Will you support it? They are calling for targeted sanctions against Israeli officials who are perpetuating the system of apartheid, just exactly the same types of sanctions you've just initiated against Vladimir Putin. Will you support it? And I think the answer is clearly you're not going to.
And those are things for which we, meaning Westerners, are directly responsible. We elected the politicians who caused this unquantifiable suffering. Those bombs were ours. We ought to be clamoring for our leaders to be dragged to The Hague to be tried for war crimes. By contrast, we, meaning Westerners, are not responsible for Putin or his actions. I cannot vote him out of office. Nothing I say will make him alter course. And worse, anything I do say against him or Russia simply amplifies the mindless chorus of self-righteous Western commentary intended to cast stones at Russia's warmongers while leaving our own homegrown warmongers in place. Westerners denouncing Putin won't make compromise and peace more likely. It will make it less likely. Russians need to be highlighting Putin's crimes as best they can to drive him to the negotiating table, while we need to be doing the same to our leaders to push them to the same table. As long as our attention is on Putin and his crimes, it is not on our leaders and their crimes. Fog of war. Those who insist it is quite possible to denounce both Putin and Western leaders at the same time are precisely the people who have been so half-hearted in holding our own leaders to account. Monbiot, the Guardian's columnist, let us note has not used a single one of his weekly columns at The Guardian to highlight the years-long plight of Julian Assange, locked away in a British dungeon for revealing United States and UK's war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is the gravest attack on a free press in living memory. And yet, Mountbayet used his most recent column to attack Assange supporters, like veteran journalist John Pilger, for not being voluble enough in denouncing Putin. Those who require unequivocal condemnation of Putin insist that now, in the midst of a war, is not the time to be sowing doubt or undermining morale in the rightness of our cause. A small giveaway that they think of this as a Western, not Ukrainian war with Russia. Again, conveniently, that is precisely the message Western leaders want to send too. Just ask Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson, whose Partygate scandal is now a distant memory, as he seeks to evoke Churchillian gravitas in facing off with Russia. Instead, the parties in the British Parliament put aside their very superficial differences this week as the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky rallied them with a historic address. What really is the point of demanding Westerners denounce Putin unequivocally when the entire Western media and political class is directing our gaze exclusively at Russia's crimes precisely so Westerners don't look at equivalent Western crimes?
I'll never apologize for the United States of America, ever. I don't care what the facts are. I will lead her. I will do my level best to stand up for freedom and democracy around the world by keeping the United States of America strong and by keeping our eyes wide open as we welcome change in the world, but keeping our eyes wide open.
The truth is that in power politics, unequivocal denunciations are for politicians and diplomats and virtue signalers. Condemnations may be emotionally satisfying, but the rest of us can put our energies to far better use. For most of us, the better course will be to blow away the immediate fog of war and instead analyze meaning the West, role in the unfolding events. NATO insurance policy. Even a cursory glance shows that the West's hands are not clean in Ukraine. Not at all. The meddling and hypocrisy have occurred in two stages, first from politicians and then from the media. It was the choices made by Western politicians that provoked the invasion, as demonstrated by the documents we read here for you. It was the choices made by Western politicians that provoked the invasion. What's coming next is an explanation, not a justification of those developments, for those who need such things spelled out clearly. Russian troops are in Ukraine not because Putin is Hitler or mad or a megalomaniac. Though, again, the invasion makes him a war criminal in the same mold as Tony Blair and George W. Bush. Russian troops are there because he and his officials judge the West to be acting malevolently and in bad faith in their dealings with Ukraine. The Putin as madman or Hitler script deflects attention away from the very obvious fact that Western leaders willfully played fast and loose with the security of Ukraine and the safety of its population. The West encouraged Ukrainians to believe that they will soon fall under NATO security umbrella, when in fact the West had no intention of protecting them, as is now only too evident. Ukrainians were led to believe that the more Russia's posture turned belligerent towards Ukraine, the more likely NATO will be to come to Ukraine's rescue and act as its savior, which of course incentivized the Ukrainian government to keep poking the Russian bear, in the expectation that Kyiv will have a NATO insurance policy up its sleeve. It didn't. It never did, as current events show. The reason Boris Johnson lost no time in rebuffing the emotional pressure levied by Ukrainian journalists at a recent press conference to impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine is that even he understands that such a policy will be suicidal against a nuclear power like Russia. Shooting down Russian jets will likely plunge us into a return or a rerun of the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which we have spoken before. But on the back of NATO's deception, recent Ukrainian leaders confidently fomented ethnic nationalism at home and thereby themselves played a dangerous game of chicken with their superpower neighbor. That included coddling anti-Russian fascists at home and stoking a related civil war in the Donbas region by its ultranationalist allies against the Russian ethnic community living there as a way to drag NATO directly into conflict. For those who accuse anyone who points out the long-running influence of ultranationalist groups in Ukraine of being Putin trolls, a video of 2017 by The Guardian, a newspaper now reflexively dismissive of all criticism of Ukraine, showing a neo-Nazi summer camp for Ukrainian children, may make for uncomfortable viewing. The Azov Brigade, fascists running it, as well as other like-minded groups, have been effortlessly incorporated into the Ukrainian military the West is arming.
We probably don't want to be rubbing shoulders with organized far-right militant groups that have, that are very open about it. I mean, you could go right now and view on YouTube their videos of their trainings. They're very forward symbolism. They're not hiding this stuff.
Canadian diplomats and soldiers in Ukraine took an unusual meeting in June of 2018, one that's now coming to light. It was a meeting with one of the paramilitary units raised to fight off the Russian invasion of Ukraine's eastern provinces. One problem, that unit, the Azov Battalion, has been linked to neo-Nazism, and the Canadian military knew.
Велику, могутню і соборну. Слава нації!
An Ottawa Citizen report says Canadian forces in Ukraine produced a briefing in 2017 saying members of the Azov Battalion identified themselves as Nazis. But the June 2018 meeting happened anyway, with a Canadian forces colonel and diplomatic staff attending. The battalion published pictures on social media saying Canadian representatives expressed their hopes for, quote, further fruitful cooperation. In a statement, the Department of National Defense says they are strongly opposed to the glorification of Nazism and all forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, intolerance, and extremism, adding, our official position remains that we are not, nor will we be providing support to Azov and affiliated entities. Brad Galloway with the Center for Hate, Bias, and Extremism has studied the Azov Battalion. He says that while some neo-Nazi groups prefer to be discreet with their imagery, the Azov Battalion is more forthright. German news found members of the unit sporting SS symbols and swastikas, and Azov prominently places the wolf's hook and black sun, two symbols favored by the Nazis, on its crest.
Maybe there's a wing of them that want to tone it down a little bit so it's playable in North America. That could be one aspect of it, but I think with the way they're doing things over in Europe, I think it's as advertised.
Galloway says what concerns him most is the Canadian government underestimating the reach of groups like the Azov Battalion. Similar to Canadians who join ISIS, Galloway warns that alienated far-right Canadians may see the Azov Battalion as a chance to turn ideology into action.
Some risk I see is that guys giving up on the movement in North America and saying, well, we should organize and go to Eastern Europe where we can actually do something, we can make a difference. And that's I think, a huge risk.
In Ottawa, Shaoli Lee, City News.
President Zelensky hasn't abandoned his pre-invasion intransigence. He has entrenched calling for Ukraine to be armed with nuclear missiles and for NATO to either impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine or give Ukraine the planes to enforce such a zone itself. That Zelensky wants NATO to bail him out, especially after NATO was responsible for enticing him into the current confrontation with Russia, is hardly surprising. But that Zelensky wants NATO to bail him out, especially after NATO was responsible for enticing him into the current confrontation with Russia, is hardly surprising. But the degree to which the Western media have pushed Zelensky's line means a strong majority of the United States public now favors Kiev's course of action, even though it would likely trigger a World War III within nuclear powers. Suicidal narrative. How enthralled Westerners are to this media confected suicidal narrative can be gauged by the number of armchair warriors in the West accusing anyone taking a more cautious approach of not only being a Putin apologist, but of denying the Ukrainian people their sovereign right to join NATO and fall under its protection. But NATO membership isn't a sovereign right, and it shouldn't be viewed as some kind of glorified neighborhood watch scheme. NATO is a military club. States qualify to join if the other members agree they want to commit to protecting that state. If NATO members don't have the ability or will to defend another state, as is the case with Ukraine, then it is a crime to pretend they do, for the very reasons the events unfolding now demonstrate. In fact, it is not just any ordinary crime, it is a crime against humanity. Every death in the current war, Ukrainian and Russian, could almost certainly have been averted had the United States and its NATO allies not led Ukraine up the garden path. Had Ukrainians not believed that with enough pressure they could force NATO's hand in their favor, they would have had to accommodate Russian concerns well before any invasion, such as by committing to neutrality. Russia would have had no grounds or pretexts, depending on how you wish to look at it, to invade. The media's madman and Hitler scripts are needed now to turn reality on its head, suggesting that Putin will have invaded whatever actions NATO and Ukraine took anyway. But if that is not true, and there is no evidence it is, then the blood of the victims of this war is most certainly on the West's hands, just as it is in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Gaza, Yemen, and elsewhere. Media hypocrisy. The second hypocrisy is the current one being peddled by the Western media. They want to flaunt a bogus moral concern about the suffering of Ukrainians on their attack from Russia that they never showed towards the victims of Western bombs and missiles. Terrible as the suffering of Ukrainians is, 2 weeks into the invasion, it is still a pale shadow of the decades of suffering of Palestinians in Gaza or Yemenis under Saudi planes and bombs supplied by the West. The prioritization of one over the other needs explaining. Social media warriors, much less sophisticated than the corporate media, readily rationalize this lack of interest in the West victims by dismissing them as terrorists or by blaming them for living under terrorist regimes or by simply insisting that they are further removed from us, as though Britons and Americans somehow feel more a natural affinity with Ukrainians than with Syrians or Palestinians or with Russians. We don't, unless the corporate media keeps insisting such a bond exists. If that strategy fails, it is on to the next one, arguing that any effort to point out the utter hypocrisy of the Western media and its entirely hollow concern for Ukrainians rather than for Ukraine as a pawn on the West colonial chessboard is so-called whataboutery. Whataboutery. What about this, what about that? Its reality is true. Back to the document. It is bad enough that such reasoning rooted in a profound racism that counts white Europeans as worthy victims and brown or black victims as collateral damage of supposed Western peacemaking. But actually, the rot runs far deeper. It is not just racism at work in the special treatment of Ukraine's suffering over that of Iraqis or Yemenis or Palestinians. That could be solved through education and awareness raising. No, the Western media's identification with Ukraine and consequently the public's identification with its plight is based on Ukraine's usefulness to the Western imperial project, which is exactly what got us into this mess in the first place. In truth, a straight line runs between the West's treatment of Iraq and its treatment of Ukraine. In Iraq, the United States and allies sought to reorder the chessboard by intensifying their grip over oil as Western capitalism began running up against over and ever depleting stores of cheap and easily accessible fossil fuels, and the climate emergency made capitalism's endless profiting-making model ever more precarious. But though the chess analogy for Western foreign policy making dates back to at least the 19th century, it may now be inadequate to explain what we have seen taking place over the past couple of decades. More accurately, Washington planners see the world largely in terms of a high-stakes version of the children's party game musical chairs. As the chairs disappear, it is ever more important to make sure you, rather than your enemies, grab the last seats. The main enemies on the global stage, if you sit in Washington, are Russia and China. The tools you need at your disposal are not just wits, as in chess, but muscle, as in a very adult survival of the fittest version of musical chairs. That has required the United States and its allies to ever more aggressively isolate Russia and China, trying to sow divisions and make each feel threatened and isolated, which, as Moscow and Beijing more clearly understands Washington's strategy, has driven these two unlikely partners into each other's arms. The rest of us have to decide which of the biggest children we want to ally with as the chairs keep disappearing and the game gets ever more vicious. Proxy war of attrition. Back in Ukraine, meanwhile, the United States and its NATO allies appear to be doing what they can do to drag out the war for as long as possible. Russia appeared initially to want a relatively short war of attrition to pacify Ukraine, forcing its nationalist government to drop aspirations to become a launchpad for NATO weapons and impose on it instead the supposed neutrality they would have signed in the documents shown before, in this case, Minsk II. Now that Russia has committed treasure and lives to the war, it will likely get greedier and want more. Reports suggest it is already demanding independence rather than autonomy for Donbas region. Of course, the conclusion even Westerners will draw, if we weren't so propagandized by the media, is that neutrality for Ukraine is inevitable, unless we are willing to risk the alternative of a World War III. Any delay in achieving neutrality for Ukraine as an outcome simply causes unnecessary death and suffering. The United States, by contrast, wants a long proxy war of attrition, covertly supplying Ukrainian forces, indifferent as to whether they are nice ones or neo-Nazis, to bog Russia down in years of difficult guerrilla warfare and counterinsurgency, like in Central and South America, for example. The bloodshed will fed the hostility and unthinking racism of Western publics towards Russia and Russians, providing the pretext for Washington to sustain the West parallel economic war on Russia. Ukrainians will pay the price as the United States seeks to wear down Russia, just as Syrians, Libyans, Iranians, Yemenis, Venezuelans, and Palestinians have paid the price, and the United States has sought to attain the goals of its globe-spanning imperial project, repeats the author. Washington understands that a weakened Russia might not have been able to save Bashar Assad's government from the takeover of Syria by the West's Islamic State and Al-Qaeda allies there, which apparently are moving now to Ukraine. And in the future, it is hoped Moscow will be in no position to support others who resist Western hegemony, especially the pariah states of Venezuela, Iran, and China. It is a huge ambition for a tiny elite headquartered in the United States, committed to the endless enrichment of itself by enforcing a binary thinking among Western publics that obscures the real reason for the planet-wide crisis we face. If it succeeds, the West's war machine will continue trundling over the bodies of the poor and marginalized as it drives us ever faster towards ecological collapse. So yeah, it's not difficult really. It's not really difficult to understand that the Western media is totally bought off. It's prepaid media. Okay, they've already been bought a cause that is not the people's cause. It's just the super rich elite's interest, as we have seen demonstrated, of course, by documents. In this case, by Russell Brand, have shown the people of the world that these intentions do exist and these documents do exist, and that is that American senators have investments in Raytheon and Boeing and other war machine bearings that, of course, are forcing Ukrainian people to leave the country. And not only that, forcing the public opinion to believe that Russia is the enemy, that Russia will have invaded no matter what, and that is a total lie, as demonstrated by the documents I said, again, Minsk 1, Minsk 2, the history behind it, the realities of the Donbas region, and the abuse of the Ukrainian army itself when it started killing more than 14,000, now the counting goes up, of its own people in the Donbas region when they make illegal to speak Russian in a Russian region, in this case Donbas, Luhansk, and the other Donetsk, which are speaking Russia-speaking language, and they are have the Russian customs, the Russian Orthodox, etc. So now this the trend has moved into the probability that these regions, after this long war that is supported by the United States, Canada, England, and NATO, will falsely accuse Russia of doing everything and to be a monster and a Hitler. Wow. Such prepaid media is in total disconnection, and not only that, it has shows us the country and the world how how they have become accomplices in all wars around the world as long as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank comes after war. That's why Chrystia Freeland is there. Last week or during this week she was there in Ukraine, and with the wife of the President Zelensky, which is a Jewish guy that is now allied with Nazis in order, he says, to protect Russians from the brutal invasion of Russia, to protect Ukrainians from the Russian invasion, the brutal invasion. The language used in these media outlets, including Democracy Now!, this is very disappointing. But thanks God, in Democracy Now!, there has been some people that are not buying this argument that Russia is to blame and Russia is guilty of everything. No way. Especially again when the documents and history prove that that war has been avoidable, averted, could have been, while if not the intentions as this document and this journalist said, and the documents prove, documents that I have read here in this program prove, it was the Americans, and still do, train assassins. And my point in here that I wanted to ask you guys, how many people are Canadians of these trained assassins, of the Nazis and all these people that are trained by Canadian troops, right now are being trained by Canadian troops? And how many of these people are we going to welcome in this country with Canadian passports and citizenship after they have made, I don't know, and nobody knows how many atrocities in Ukraine, these Nazi people? How many of those are you going to invite here, Mrs. Freeland and Prime Minister Harper? Is a question that we need to know. We Canadians need to know. We don't want any of those guys here. Not assassins like has been proven by Syria. In a Spanish document that I put 3 or 4 years ago, I demonstrated by the testimony of a Catholic nun that she was there in Syria. Syria was a very known place in the Middle East for people to travel. Believe it or not, Syria was a tourist destination for other people that work in the Arabic countries before the so-called uprising of the peoples in the Middle East. Forget how they call it. The nun explains in that document openly that that is a word that was created on a desk. That's her words. You should see it on my Spanish version. And that these people were not Syrian people. The people that she saw there when they started terrorizing Syrian people were, of course, mercenaries from other areas that didn't speak the Syrian language but have other dialects, Arabic dialects. And these people were forced, the Syrian people, to convert to Islam or die. Why that? Because in those days in Syria, whomever have read a little bit of history and knows something about Syria, not that I'm an expert, but I'm a concerned citizen and I like to read history as a duty, we know that the Syrian people, as a tourist place for the Arabic world, something that you don't know but I do, and you should know, was because Syria was open with all kinds of peoples and beliefs. Syria was a destination, Idlib was a destination for the Arabic people. This nun, she was working in Egypt. You know, as a Catholic, it's a very difficult conditions. Egypt can be a very extremist country and, Muslim. And she said, okay, I'm in Egypt, I need some vacation. She asked for a vacation and she moved to Syria, as many Arabic people, speaking Arabic people do in all those countries that are Muslim countries. And they went to Syria to have vacations. That's how Syria was secure and safe. And she describes how the CNN and the mainstream media in those days, 2010, 2011, was saying that the Syrian people are rising up against Bashar al-Assad. That was not true, according to her and her testimony. She was there in the streets of Idlib, and she saw that Aleppo, which was the industrial capital of Syria, was being taken over by this kind of people that didn't speak Syrian but other dialects, and were forcing people to convert to Islam, tying them to posts, killing them, chopping them into pieces, and putting them in bags, garbage bags. In other cases, they mark the Christian houses. You have to understand that many people that were not in good relations, especially Christians, with extreme Muslim countries like Saudi Arabia, for example, they have to move to places like Syria in order to leave their Christianity, no problem. What they did was to put the Nun letter, which means Nazarene. That's how the Arabic people describe us Christians, as Nazarenes. They use the letter Nun. They put the letter Nun in the houses of the Christian people in order for the invaders to come and kill them, displace them, and take them out of their houses. Something that you should know that is not talked about in the Western media, but I covered with this nun that speaks very clearly about how the media is corrupted to the core. And it was not the Syrian people that lived up in the so-called Arab Spring, with the snow spring, and it was not Arabic, it was all kinds of mercenaries, including Al-Qaeda, jihadists, etc., that once before in the 80s and 90s were supposedly allies of the United States and then become enemies. But they're back in Ukraine. How many of these people are we going to give citizenship here in Canada? Yeah, so I've been doing this for many years. For more than 20 years I have reported on issues, especially coming from a country like Colombia, which I'm going to dedicate a whole chapter to. Okay, I leave this comment right there. What is your opinion on these matters? Do you agree with the question, even though this is from April? This document is from April. What do you think about it? Are you gonna keep buying in these poor Ukrainian people around the world? Yes, poor Ukrainian people around the world being refugees and all, sure. And what about the black people in Morocco? That Morocco is taking Africa, its neighbor, and killing them for a long time now, more than since 1975. The United States doesn't say that. The refugees that are running to Italy, they come from Ethiopia, they come from all places, Libya of course, and they're not accepted because they're black. And they're very poor. They're not economically viable. And the strong position that Canada has taken against its own people in the case of the pandemic, which only demonstrates once again that the elites of this world are not for us, for the country, or for the world. They are for themselves. And the institutions are being corrupted to the core, which were created to support the constitutionality of this monarchical constitution, in this case Canada, to support it's being used against us. It's being demonstrated during this week that there was no need to use the Emergency Act as such, even though Prime Minister Trudeau insists with Chrystia Freeland that it was necessary. The parliamentary discussions this week have demonstrated that it was not necessary, that it was anti-constitutional, and that the RCMP and CSIS, that is the Canadian intelligence apparatus and organizations didn't have to call an emergency act. It was imposed to them, and they just supported it because Prime Minister Justin Trudeau decided that it was applicable when it was not, according to the Constitution that we read before, videos that were banned by YouTube. According to the Constitution, that's not going to go.
If you were looking at the actions taken by the government flowing from the invocation, and if you uncover evidence indicating that the invocation of the act was inappropriate, then everything that flowed from it was inappropriate as well.
Welcome back to This Guy's Garage. I can't stress how important this video is. It speaks to the intent and the use of the Emergencies Act by its author. What we learn here is profound, and I think this is information that every Canadian needs to see, whether you agree with the use or not. I look forward to hearing everything that you guys have to say. Here are some of the ways you can help get that information out there.
We will now provide you the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the invitation to speak to the committee. At the outset, I want to stress that I'm not here as President and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, but as a private citizen and as a former minister who was responsible for the creation of the Emergencies Act. Any opinions that I express are solely mine. I hope I can help the committee by explaining our motivation in replacing the old War Measures Act with modern emergencies legislation, by describing the principles that guided us, and by offering some questions for you to consider. I won't offer an opinion on whether invoking the act was justified. I've not seen sufficient evidence to reach a conclusion. I note that the Commissioner of the OPP stated last week that the province's Intelligence Bureau considered the blockades a national security threat a week before Ottawa invoked the act. I hope you'll insist on seeing that assessment and will evaluate the quality of the intelligence on which it was based. Indeed, the committee should press for any information to help Canadians understand the rationale for invocation and test against both the facts of the situation and the deliberately high threshold that is required. Let me briefly provide some history. In 1988, Parliament voted unanimously to replace the War Measures Act with legislation that was designed to help the government respond quickly and effectively to a range of emergencies that went well beyond war or insurrection, while safeguarding Canadians' basic rights. The War Measures Act was enacted in World War I in the heat of a crisis when safeguarding civil liberties was not a priority. It was used in both world wars, partly due to perceived threats from enemy aliens. The government used it to arrest, incarcerate, deport, and seize the property of thousands of Canadians of Ukrainian, Japanese, Italian, and German heritage. The Act's third and only peacetime invocation was during the October crisis of 1970, when the FLQ kidnapped the British Trade Commissioner in Montreal and the Deputy Premier of Quebec, Pierre Laporte. The War Measures Act suspended civil liberties across the country. It retroactively made FLQ membership a crime and required those who had ever attended any of its meetings to prove that they were not members. It authorized arrest without a charge or access to a lawyer and confinement for up to 21 days, as well as property searches without a warrant. It was outside of the Canadian Bill of Rights, and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms did not exist. We needed a flexible tool to deal quickly and effectively with a range of potential emergencies and to safeguard the rights of citizens, of the provinces, and of Parliament. While no one could predict the exact circumstances, Canada would inevitably face future crises where we would have to protect Canadians' lives and safety, and even the existence of the country itself. However, any powers would be strictly limited and be overseen by the courts and by Parliament. The declaration of an emergency does not absolve Parliament of its responsibilities. Instead, it makes Parliament's role even more important. So I want to make sure that I'm actually answering the question that you asked. It has to meet the standards of a national emergency. That is, the consequences have to be so severe that the welfare of the country as a whole are affected. However, that does not mean that the emergency has to have taken place in all regions of the country itself. In the case of the October 70 crisis, the crisis was essentially limited to Quebec. And yet the civil liberties of Canadians right across the country were suspended. And censorship was used in Guelph, Ontario, with the University of Guelph student newspaper, and also in Vancouver there was a threat to use the act as well, although it was not necessary to have it there. We wanted to have legislation that the government could say, there's a grave crisis here, it meets the definition of a national emergency, but we aren't going to suspend everybody's rights. We're going to...
Mr. Beatty? I don't wish to be impolite, but oh, my time is up. I'm sorry, Mr. Beatty. 2 minutes goes by so quickly. Sorry.
And I'm going to finish, guys, with another part of this show, and that is the pandemic. It's inevitable not to talk about the result of the pandemic and how immunity matters. Okay, Immunity Matters by Daryl James. Dr. Bonnie Henry continues to disregard prior infections and fired thousands of healthcare professionals, many who had better immunity than those who are fully vaccinated. It starts with the public health orders, which contain the following erroneous clause. Section C. A full course of vaccine provides more effective and durable protection against infection and severe illness than natural immunity from prior COVID-19 infection alone, or natural immunity in combination with a single dose of vaccine, says Section C. This statement has been challenged by at least 140 scientific studies to date, with the overwhelming consensus supporting that natural infection elicits both longer-lasting and more durable protection than vaccination. This, according to the wellnessway.com Natural Immunity, 140 studies of validation. So it's not a lie, the document is there, you can confirm it. The World Health Organization has recognized since May 2021 that natural immunity is equivalent to vaccination. You can find that document at World Health Organization.int/publications /I/WHO/2019 COVID-SIV Brief Natural Immunity. Brief on Natural Immunity 2021. Again, the World Health Organization has recognized since May 2021 that natural immunity is equivalent to vaccination. I just give you the site where you can find yourself. I quote, "To conclude, available tests and current knowledge do not tell us about the duration of immunity and protection against reinfection. But recent evidence suggests that natural infection may provide similar protection against symptomatic disease as vaccination, at least for the available follow-up period," unquote. On February 9, 2022, Dr. Bonnie Henry announced an order that requires all regulated health professionals to be vaccinated against COVID-19 by March 24, 2022, to work in their occupation in British Columbia, for example. You can find that in news.gov.bc.ca release on 2022. Again, on February 9, 2022, Dr. Bonnie Henry announced an order that requires all regulated health professionals to be vaccinated against COVID-19 by March 24, 2022, to work in their occupation in British Columbia. This affects at least 30 professionals, including chiropractors, dentists, pharmacists, and massage therapists. After that date, anyone who remains unvaccinated will have their professional accreditation revoked and not be allowed to work again in this province. Recall that she also mandated vaccination for all doctors, nurses, and support staff in primary care facilities on October 26, 2021. You can see that on www.2.gov.bc.ca, Assets Government Health About BC. Those who refuse and appeal her decision based on evidence of natural immunity were fired with cause, with no severance pay and no eligibility to collect unemployment insurance. And you say that Hitler is in Ukraine? Mother of God. On January 26, Dr. Bonnie Bonnie Henry advised during a conference call on childcare. On January 26, Dr. Bonnie Henry advised during a conference call on childcare that, I quote, Omicron is spreading in people who are vaccinated and unvaccinated. We are seeing the vaccine is probably 30 to 40% effective, so it does reduce your risk a little bit. But it means the whole community is at risk now of getting infection. The risk of shedding live virus so you can infect somebody else after 5 days with Omicron is about 15%. But Dr. Bonnie Henry permits anyone who is vaccinated to return to work 5 days after the onset of symptoms, even if they continue to have a runny nose, sore throat, or cough. The policy includes anyone working in a hospital or regulated healthcare setting. So, during the peak of the Omicron wave, when hospitals were overwhelmed and staff were overworked and barely coping, Dr. Bonnie Henry then kept hundreds of healthcare workers with near-perfect immunity unemployed with no income to feed their families. At the same time, she encouraged COVID-positive doctors and nurses to return to work and spread the virus, infecting as many as 62 healthcare facilities at one point in January. And now, her latest move is to repeat this malpractice in all regulated healthcare settings while calmly sympathizing with the traumatic effect her mandates have had on people's mental and psychological health. Really? Firing a doctor who understands she has better and longer-lasting immunity than a vaccine is perfectly reasonable, and putting a chiropractor permanently out of work is needed because these people have been causing widespread disease and death? It is clear that Dr. Bonnie Henry is following our Prime Minister's approach of mandating vaccinations on everyone despite the human or social cost, while ignoring the science, saying it is no longer needed in many cases. We need to recognize that possibility. Over half of the unvaccinated population already has comparable or superior immunity to vaccination and are not a threat to our healthcare system or anyone else. As a society, we need to follow the science, even if it means walking back some of the vitriol we have directed towards this extremely marginalized group. While mandates have encouraged many to get vaccinated for the benefit of everyone, there comes a time when punishing the unvaccinated, especially those with immunity, is just plain wrong. Many are praying that Dr. Bonnie Henry is wiser than our Prime Minister and adjusts her policies to reflect the new reality of the Omicron variant in a way that allows unvaccinated families to feed their children and keep a roof over their heads. Unjustified firing everyone who is unvaccinated without considering their immunity is cruel and seriously harms innocent children. That is why the protests began here in Canada with the truckers. First open letter to the World Health Organization pandemic treaty by World Council of Health, the World Council of Health. We'll get to that. The World Health Organization Agreement, March 8, 2022. This is from March, but it's important. I know it's 2 months later, but this is important in order for us to understand how things are developing regarding the vaccination program all around the world. Because if you see what Australia is doing to its people with batooning them violently, sending them to hospitals and jail, using the police force worse than in America. I never thought that of Australia, but it's doing it. And what Mr. Harper was trying to do, I'm correct here, Mr. Justin Trudeau was trying to do here last Saturday with the peaceful rally of the motorcycles, sending all those cops was to do exactly that. But it didn't work, Mr. Justin Trudeau, because we Canadians are not that stupid. We know that you will use force against us. So we did what we always do as Canadians, and peacefully show you that we are not with you, that you are not for us, for the country, for the world. You're against us and the country, Mr. Justin Trudeau. And we want the world to know that if we can use a referendum before you finish your mandate, we will use it to take you out of office with Chrystia Freeland and, of course, your Liberal Party, which is supporting all these stupid mandates. And it's not funny, but insulting to see you liberals with all those masks in Parliament lying to us, the country and the world. You should see, of course, the interview that was made on Jordan Peterson, speaking about how Jordan Peterson and Prime Minister, being both Canadians, can be in opposite sides that way. Very interesting document.
My question is pointed, yes or no. What I repeated to you is constitutionally protected under the Charter, yes or no?
If they had stuck to those principles, we wouldn't be here.
Is it true that we did have to designate the war memorial due to the desecration and of men and women actually urinating on the war memorial? Was it necessary to invoke the Emergency Act in order to protect the war memorial?
Sadly, yes. It's a matter of public record.
Well, I'm not sure there's a question there, except to say that I have faith in Canadians' sensibility.
I'll ask you a question. In my 35 years of law enforcement experience, I have a built-in BS detector, a built-in lie detector, if you will, and it's dinging big time.
I'm going to start off by looking at some of the earlier events that took place before the invocation of the Act. We know that the convoy itself declared a bunch of demands, and that was shared on social media quite extensively. They wanted to end all vaccine passports, including all inter-Canadian passports. They want to eliminate all mandatory programs of vaccination and contract tracing. They wanted rights of those who are vaccine-free to be respected. They wanted divisive rhetoric attacking Canadians who disagree with government mandates to stop at once, and to end all censorship of those with opinions contrary to the government. There is nothing in those public demands that would cause any federal government to have any concerns, because that is an expression of opinion as enshrined and protected by the Charter. Yes or no?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Brock. Indeed, there are statements that are protected by the Charter. What we're looking at here, though, were the actions that were taken, and that's what we focus on.
About actions, Minister?
Well, no, we can't distinguish the two.
Minister, you can distinguish that. I gave you a set of principles that the convoy protest indicated in their social media. My question is pointed, yes or no. What I repeated to you is constitutionally protected under the Charter, yes or no.
If they had stuck to those principles, we wouldn't be here.
I'm not asking that. Is it a yes or a no, sir?
They are constitutionally protected principles, but the actions were not.
Thank you. Now let's talk about the Memorandum of Understanding, or the manifesto. Is it your opinion today, as shared by the Prime Minister, as shared by other senior minister officials, that the manifesto itself called out for a violent overthrow of the Canadian government? Is that your understanding?
The manifesto itself was one indicator of the reasons that we took into consideration as we have tabled in the House of Commons. It was one factor that indicated amongst many other factors, including many actions, that forced us to take the measure.
And I'm not talking about other factors. I'm talking about the manifesto.
You can't distinguish them, Mr. Brock.
I can, because it's my question to you, Minister. The question is very simple. The manifesto itself, did you interpret that as a violent overthrow of the Canadian government?
I read the manifesto for the words that it contained, and as we did across the government, it was a factor that we considered amongst many other factors and many other actions.
I'll ask the question again, Minister.
In whether or not
did you
to declare the
interpret that
Emergencies
as a violent overthrow of the Canadian government?
Could the minister be allowed to answer the question?
He's not answering the question. That's the problem.
On va suspendre le temps, M. Brock. Je vais juste.
Okay. First open letter on the World Health Organization Pandemic Treaty by World Council for Health, March 8, 2022. Just another document that is true, exists. Stop the treaty. The World Health Organization is unnecessary and threatens our sovereignty and inalienable rights. The World Health Organization aims to confirm the pandemic agreement in the 77th World Health Assembly in 2024. But it could happen much sooner. World Council for Health will continue to raise awareness through campaigning against this undemocratic move. This goes to people throughout the world, governments, presidents, health ministers, independent media. To World Health Organization via World Health Assembly, Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, Dr. Swaminathan, to United Nations via Antonio Guterres, Liu Shemin, Elliot Harris, Maria Francisca Espatolizano. The World Council for Health, WCH, the World Council for Health, a coalition of scientists, doctors, lawyers, and civil society advocacy organizations, opposes the World Health Organization WHO's moves to implement a power grab in the form of a global pandemic agreement while the world's attention is diverted by latest crisis. The proposed WHO Health Organization agreement is unnecessary and is a threat to sovereignty and inalienable rights. It increases the WHO's suffocating power to declare unjustified pandemics, impose dehumanizing lockdowns, and enforce expensive, unsafe, and ineffective treatments against the will of the people. The WCH, the World Council for Health, believes that the people have a right to participate in any agreement that affects their lives, livelihoods, and well-being. However, the World Health Organization has not engaged in a process of public participation, which is evidence that its priority is capturing more power for itself and its corporate accomplices than serving the interests of the peoples. Without an unbiased democratic process, any agreement by the World Health Organization acting via the United Nations will be unlawful, illegitimate, and invalid, says the organization. That is the World Council for Health. Historically, the World Health Organization leadership has failed the people. Among many examples, it approved the injurious H1N1 swine flu vaccine for a controversially declared pandemic. Equally, the WHO failed during the COVID-19 chapter as it encouraged lockdowns, suppressed early preventive treatments, and recommended product interventions that have proven to be neither safe nor effective. The WHO cannot be allowed to control the world's health agenda, nor enforce biosurveillance while it receives funding from public sources belonging to the people. It is caught in a perpetual conflict of interest because it also receives substantial funding from private interests that use their contributions to influence and profit from World Health Organization decisions and mandates. For example, the Gates Foundation and the Gates-founded Gavi Vaccine Promotion Alliance contribute over $1 billion a year. A call to action. The WCH partners from Australia to Zimbabwe stand against this costly abuse of power and assert the sovereign right of people to make their own decisions over and above what their representatives may want. We urge everyone to approach credible government representatives, political parties, trade unions, civil society groups, professionals, public figures, and independent media to raise awareness about the implications of the proposed global pandemic agreement, call for national campaigns that protect natural law and democratic constitutions, join credible civil society coalitions such as the World Council for Health. We also encourage everyone to learn more about principles, accords, conventions, and treaties that protect the rights of men, women, and children. These include the Syracuse Principles in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which provide legal standards to protect rights. Leading up to the World Health Organization's 77th World Health Assembly in 2024, where the WHO intends to confirm their pandemic agreement, the WCH will continue to raise awareness through campaigning against this undemocratic move. If you or your organization want to support World Council for Health in this crucial campaign, connect via info@worldcouncilforhealth.org. Become a partner with your organization. Donate and be aware. So news from around the world. For example, Sweden justified in implementing only minimal lockdown rules. Referendum in Switzerland rejects funding for state media corporations. Why will that be? For example, in the case of Canada, Canada the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, it spends billions of dollars, 1.6. Just the government gives more than $1 billion. But I explained that document also here in React Today as part of the World Whale Project. While here in Canada, I want to insist to go with the vaccination program and keep your mask and social distancing forever. In Switzerland, they're lifting up the mandates. Switzerland has voted strongly to reject government plans to increase state funding for media organizations. The referendum was directly related to a bill approved by the Swiss government in Bern to grant aid for media companies in the region of 151 million Swiss francs a year. Switzerland utilized its democratic political decision-making process by holding a referendum on the issue. Opponents of the bill gathered thousands of signatures in a petition to set up the vote. That's what we need to do here in Canada, stand for a referendum in order to take out of power these immoral mandates, these crazy mandates that take the food out of the table. How are people supposed to live, Justin, Christian? How dare you take the food out of our tables for your children? How dare you take such illegal measurements like enacting the Emergency Act? We need to cause a referendum here in Canada, because while all this is happening around the world, with Switzerland is saying, okay, we're going to call referendum, we don't want the media to be supported with much more money, 151 million a year in this case for the media in Switzerland, because of what they're doing with us, the country and the world. For New Zealand, for Australia, I wish the police understand that they're to protect their people. That institution is democratic constitution, in their democratic constitution, is to protect the people, not to abuse them, to accompany them in their peaceful protests, like we did in Canada. Justin Trudeau wanted to beat us up. We didn't give them the chance. And here in Canada, the police sided with the people in many occasions, demonstrated on videos, and of course demonstrating also that the liberals look on us, the country and the world, people that are not vaccinated, for scientific reasons and independent reason that is protected by the Constitution, as I read it too a couple editions ago. We don't want you in power anymore, because you are for the corporations, and the corporations, the problem is, are taking over the institutions that are to protect us, the country and the world. That is the healthcare system. In order for people to get fired from their jobs, doctors, and if you don't agree with this, your license can be revoked. That is Stalinism. I never see Hitler doing that. And I have read plenty of books about this guy. But what about the new Hitler, which is no doubt Chrystia Freeland and Justin Trudeau and their new view of the world? Without public consent, without our consent. That's dictatorial, Mr. Trudeau, and we don't want you in government any longer. In the meantime, this is happening in Canada. Tamara, you work for the healthcare services here in Edmonton, Alberta. Am I right?
16 and a half years.
How long?
16 and a half years.
And why don't you tell our audience, how come you lose your job?
Due to the vaccine mandates. I refused to take it, and as a result, I lost my job because of it.
And what hospital were you working, if you don't mind telling us?
I don't think I can say at this time, right now. There's ongoing behind-the-scenes things, so just keep that hush-hush for now. But
how many people lose their jobs because of the mandates?
there was about 3,000 of us that were off because
in Alberta, or just in the city?
In Alberta, yeah.
Okay, am I right when I say that Jason Kenney was also firing healthcare workers before the pandemic began?
Yeah.
We were speaking about 10,000 in Alberta alone, eh?
Yeah, there's lots. I don't know the exact number, but there was a lot of us.
So then the pandemic began in 2019, 2020, now 2020, 2021, and 2022.
That's right.
In what year did you lose your job?
This was last year, 2021.
Okay, and that was 6 months, year and a half after the pandemic?
November, yeah, that's right.
November 2021?
Yes.
And how has that affected your income, your life?
Christmas was hard. Christmas was very hard for my family. Wasn't able to provide the things that I wanted to. Had to really pinch my pennies. It's been a struggle. My Disneyland fund has been drained, that I've had savings for years and years and years to try to take my little one to Disneyland. She's here. She's here with me today. And Pebbles is here too.
Nice.
Yeah, it's been very difficult.
Very difficult situation. Have you been in contact with some of your co-workers that lose their jobs? They're in the same situation?
Yeah, they're in the same situation. Everything's been very difficult. It's been financially, emotionally, and mentally draining on all of us.
I can't believe that. Have you been necessarily obligated to go to social services or something like that?
Not yet. I'm trying to avoid that if I can. I've racked up my visa. Trying to find other ways to make money right now. So.
Okay, good luck with that one.
Thank you very much.
And just one last question. What do you see for the foreseeable future if Mr. Justin Trudeau keeps these mandates going, following a scientific method that is not really debated in Congress?
Right. It's gonna get worse, I think, before it gets better. We need to get him out. He does not have the best interest of Canada at heart at all.
Yeah, we all do agree. This is a sweater that you have made in order to remember what exactly?
The date that I was hired, when they told me I couldn't work, then they changed it again and said I couldn't work in October, and then November, and then finally December. So, yeah, it was...
In memoriam.
Yep, so I had that.
Do you know that if you get identified as buying this kind of dressing and t-shirts, your phones, your account can be frozen?
Banned? Yeah, I believe it.
It's ridiculous. What happened to Canada? Okay, I will not comply. We stand here in solidarity with Ottawa and the bikers there.
Absolutely.
Amen. What is your thought about these matters? I know it's not easy to digest, but it's important for us, the country and the world, especially here in Canada, to understand what's going on and defeat and take the bull from the head. Otherwise, it's gonna stomp on us like it's doing, taking our jobs and our possibilities. What is it that you want? Bombs in the street, Mr. Nurses, chiropractors, doctors, tradesmen, all in the streets, living in the crumbs of your social services? I don't think so, dude. For us, for the country, for the world, hope to see you next time in the next edition of React Today as part of the World's Wild Project. Au revoir. Bye-bye. Hasta pronto.